Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perik Bet Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnah should be Leilun Nishmat Neria Ben Svetlana Ranbaim Deliyahu Ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. In yesterday's Mishnah, we learned that one is permitted to distance the double posts from the well by any amount, making the enclosed area as large as one wants, provided that one adds enough boards between them so that no gap is wider than the maximum allowed, which was 10 amot according to Rabbi Meir and 13 1/3 amot according to Rabbi Yehuda. In this Mishnah, in today's Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with this ruling of the previous Mishnah that we mentioned, and Rabbi Yehuda says, Ad bet satayim, it is permitted to enlarge the area only until it reaches the size of 2 bet se'ah, which is 50 by 100 amot. If the area is any larger, carrying within it is forbidden. And the commentators explain to us a bet se'ah is an area in which 1 se'ah, measure of volume of grain seeds, is planted. It measures 50 by 50 amot. Therefore, 2 bet se'ah are 50 by 100 amot, or 5,000 square amot. Now, Rabbi Yehuda's ruling is based on an accepted rabbinic law that in some cases carrying is forbidden even in an enclosed area, meaning even in a biblically private domain, if it is larger than 2 bet se'ah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, this prohibition includes the area around the well that is enclosed by the minimal partitions of double posts and boards. The sages, however, disagree. Amrulo, the sages said to him, Lo amru bet satayim ela lagina v'lakarpef. They did not say that there is a maximum limit of 2 bet se'ah except in regards to a garden or a karpef, which are non-residential areas. Now, a karpef, the Rav says, is a large fenced area outside a town used for such purposes as storing wood. Now, the commentaries explain people do not live or conduct regular living activities in a garden or in a karpef. Now, according to biblical law, any enclosed area, no matter how large, is a reshut yachid in which carrying is permitted. The rabbis, however, were afraid that a large non-residential area might be confused with a reshut harabim. So for this reason, they prohibited carrying in an enclosed non-residential area that is larger than 2 bet se'ah, as the Gemara says on page 67b in Masechet Eruvin. They gave such areas the status of ikar milit. Now, aval im haya dir o sachar o mukse o chatzer, if it was a pen, which the pen discussed here is a section of land surrounded by temporary fences. Now, animals are kept in it so that they will fertilize the ground with their manure. Once they have fertilized one area, the pen is moved to another area. Or a sacha, which a sacha, the Rav says, is an enclosure for animals that is inside a town. Now, these two areas, pen and sacha, are considered places where people live because shepherds stay there constantly to tend to the animal, as the Ritba explains in his commentary on page 22a in Masechet Eruvin. Or a backyard, or a courtyard. Now, the yards behind the houses were used to store everyday items, while the yards in front of the houses, the courtyards, were used for many daily activities. Now, these places, which are considered residential because people use them frequently for their everyday living activities, afilu bet chameshet korin, afilu bet aseret korin mutar. Even if the enclosed area in these places is 5 bet kol, which is 150 bet se'ah, or even 10 bet kol, 300 bet se'ah, meaning the Tosfot saying there is no upper limit, carrying within it is permitted. Now, since these areas are used for activities of everyday living, people will not confuse them with the reshut harabim, which is not used for such activities. Now, the area around the well is also residential because people enter it to draw the water. Therefore, it is permitted to place the post far from the well, making the enclosed area larger by any amount, provided that one adds enough boards between them so that no gap exceeds the maximum allowed. Now, like we discussed in Mishnah 1. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, however, one may not carry even in a completely residential area such as a courtyard that is larger than 2 bet se'ah unless it is surrounded by regular closed partitions. Now, the area around the well is surrounded not by regular partitions, but by isolated double posts and boards, which form partitions that are more open than closed. So in his view, it may not be larger than 2 bet se'ah, as the Gemara explains on page 19b in Masechet Eruvin. And the Rav says that the halacha follows the sages, that you are allowed to place the post far from the well, making the enclosed area larger by any amount, again, provided that one adds enough boards between them so that no gap exceeds the maximum allowed. The halakha follows the opinion of the Chachamim, not Rabbi Yehuda. And that is the end of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Dal now cites a dispute as to whether one may carry in the area around the well if a public road passes between the posts. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im hayta derech harabim mafsekatan, if a public road cuts between the posts, meaning the partitions formed by them are now invalid, and carrying in the enclosed area is forbidden. Now, normally each side of the well's enclosure is considered one long partition, despite any gaps in it, as long as no gap is wider than 10 or 13 and 2/3 amot. But if the public travels freely through it, it cannot be viewed like this. Therefore, Yisaleken al tzadin, one should divert the road to the sides of the enclosed area so that it does not disqualify the partitions. But the sages say, Enot tzarich, one does not need to divert the road because it does not render the partitions invalid. And the Rav says, Ven halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the rabbis permitted carrying in an area enclosed by minimal partitions of boards, double posts and straight boards, only to allow pilgrims to draw water for their animals. So for this reason, such partitions are valid only as long as the well or the other water source that they enclose provides water. If the water dries up, the partitions are no longer valid and carrying in the area becomes forbidden again. Now, the rabbis were concerned that in some cases the water might dry up and yet the people would continue carrying there out of habit. So to prevent this from happening, the rabbis limited the use of these partitions. Echad bor harabim uver harabim uver hayachid osin lahen pasin. Whether the water source is a public water hole, a pit in which rainwater collects, or a public well, which wells are fed by underground sources of flowing water, while water holes are merely pits in the ground in which rainwater collects. A water hole is more likely to dry up than a well. So whether the water source is a public water hole, a public well, or a private well, we may make these minimal partitions of boards to draw water from them. Aval levora yachid osino mechitza gevoa asat tvachim. To draw water from a private water hole, we must make a regular partition that is 10 tefachim high. Now, these minimal partitions do not suffice to enclose a private water hole because it has two deficiencies. A water hole is more likely to dry up than a well. And B, since it's a private hole which is used only by a few people, if it does dry up, there will not be enough people present to remind one another not to carry. Now, the Rav does say if the source of water, hole or well, is public, it does not matter if the water runs dry, because since it's used by a relatively large number of people, they will remind one another that carrying is no longer permitted. And there's no concern in the case of a well, even if it's private, because a well is unlikely to run dry in the first place. Now, the rabbis decreed, therefore, in the case of a private water hole, because of these two deficiencies, that to permit carrying around this private water hole, we must use regular closed partitions which are valid even if the water dries up. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, these are the words of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba Omer, however, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba rules more stringently. He says, En osin pasin ela lever rabim bilvad. We may not make minimal partitions of boards for any water source except a public well, which has two advantages. A well rarely dries up, and even if it does, the relatively large number of people present will remind one another not to carry. But for all the other sources of water, private wells, public and private water holes, we must make a belt, which is a regular closed partition around the area that is 10 tefachim high. And Tosfot explains that Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba calls the partition a belt to teach that it must surround the water source on all sides, just as a belt completely surrounds the person who wears it. And the Rav says, V'chen halacha, the halacha follows the more stringent opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, that we may not make minimal partitions of boards for any water source except a public well, because of the two advantages that it has. And that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.